June 1944. The desert heat of North Africa pressed down like a living thing, swallowing sound and mercy alike. Corporal Erich Weber lay on a makeshift cot beneath a canvas tent that flapped weakly in the hot wind, the air thick with dust, blood, and the sickly sweet stench of rot. He knew that smell too well. Gangrene, his own flesh dying by the hour. 3 days earlier, a piece of shrapnel had torn through his thigh during the chaos near Kasserine Pass, and now the wound had turned dark, the color of bruised plum spreading toward his hip like poison vines. Each heartbeat pulsed agony through his leg, and each breath tasted of rust and fear. He was 23, and he knew he would lose the leg if he lived long enough for someone to take it. The propaganda films had warned him what capture meant. Americans tortured prisoners. They amputated without anesthesia. They laughed while their victims screamed. His commander had promised it. No mercy from the cowboys. So Erich waited for the saw. But outside the tent came something unexpected. The easy murmur of English voices, laughter, the faint rattle of a tin cup against a canteen. Someone was whistling a tune. The sound was ordinary, careless, almost human. He couldn't make sense of it. The enemy was near enough to touch, and they were laughing. A shadow crossed the fabric of the tent. The flap lifted. Bright light flooded in, and a young American officer stepped inside. The man wore a khaki uniform marked with the insignia of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. His face was drawn with exhaustion, streaked with sweat and sand, but his eyes were steady. He carried no weapon. "Guten Tag," the American said softly, his German awkward but clear. "You're my patient. We'll try something new." Erich blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. Patient? The word didn't fit. He was a prisoner, not a man to be treated. The officer pulled up a metal stool and leaned over the leg. The bandages peeled away with a wet hiss. Beneath them, flesh glistened black and gray. Flies gathered instantly. The smell filled the tent like smoke. The American didn't flinch. "Bad," he murmured, then looked up. "But maybe not hopeless." He turned to a medic waiting nearby and said something in English that Erich couldn't follow, a tone of command without cruelty. The medic hurried off. Erich's pulse hammered. Was this the moment? The blade? The crude field surgery the propaganda had promised? His mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. "Bitte. Not the saw." The American paused, understanding enough to shake his head. "No saw," he said. "Something better." From the medic's kit, he took a small glass vial, clear as desert light, a label smudged with English letters Erich couldn't read. He drew the liquid into a syringe, the needle glinting in the dusty air. "This is new medicine," the captain said quietly, more to himself than to the man on the cot. "We'll see if it can save you." Erich stared at the vial, at the calm in the man's voice. It made no sense. The enemy was supposed to hate him, not help him. But in that moment, beneath the roar of flies and the distant hum of trucks, something fragile flickered in the young soldier's mind. A sliver of hope so small he barely recognized it. He expected steel and pain. Instead, the American doctor reached for glass and mercy. He expected steel and pain. Instead, the American doctor reached for glass and mercy. He expected death. What he received was uncertainty, because what the captain called new medicine might just kill him faster than the infection. The next morning, the desert light poured through the tent walls like liquid fire. Erich Weber was still alive, though the world around him spun in a fever haze. The smell of alcohol and dust clung to his skin. He could hear the faint hum of engines outside, the shuffle of boots, the low rhythm of American voices working with quiet efficiency. His leg throbbed like it was being eaten from the inside out. The bandages had been changed during the night, but beneath them the flesh still burned. He remembered the words of the young doctor, Captain Robert Hale, and that strange promise, "We'll try something new." Hale stood beside him again now, his shirt sleeves rolled up, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. Across from him, a nurse prepared a tray, Lieutenant Sarah Collins, tall, calm, her movements precise, her uniform marked with the faded insignia of the Army Nurse Corps. She looked at the vial in Hale's hand, her brow tense. "Sir," she said softly, "you're sure about this?" Hale didn't answer right away. "We don't have the luxury of certainty anymore, Lieutenant. We're running out of time. And medicine." She hesitated, then nodded. "The War Department still says this antibiotic is for our wounded. Prisoners aren't." "He's my patient," Hale interrupted, his tone even but final. "We took an oath, not a flag." Those words hung in the air like a quiet rebellion. Erich caught fragments of the exchange. Not the meaning, but the emotion. He saw the conflict in their faces, the doubt, the duty, the strange insistence that his life mattered. The needle went in. A burning fire spread through his hip and into his veins. His entire body stiffened as the pain collided with fever. For a moment, the tent dissolved into white light. When he woke again, it was night. A lantern burned dimly near the cot. The air had cooled, and someone was sitting beside him. It was Collins, her hair tied back, fatigue etched into every motion. She was reading aloud from a German medical pamphlet she had found in a captured field kit, pronouncing each word carefully. "Rest and drink water," she said haltingly, offering a canteen. "Langsam, slowly." Her accent was poor, but her intent was unmistakable. He obeyed. Outside, voices drifted closer. A young medic ducked in carrying a tin cup that smelled faintly of coffee and something sweeter. "Got a treat for you, Fritz," the medic grinned. "Chocolate, Hershey's finest." He broke the bar in half and handed it to Erich. "You need it more than I do." The kindness hit harder than any drug. Erich stared at the dark square of chocolate in his palm as if it were some relic from another world. "Why?" he asked in broken English. The medic shrugged. "Because it's what my sister would want." He tapped his chest. "Philadelphia." The name meant nothing to Erich, but the gesture, sharing food with the enemy, broke through years of fear. He chewed slowly, tasting sugar and confusion. Over the next 2 days, time blurred. Every 4 hours the nurse returned with the vial. Each injection burned less than the last. The fever that had consumed him began to fade. Hale visited often, checking the wound, scribbling notes, listening to Erich's pulse through a battered stethoscope. "Color's coming back," Hale murmured once almost to himself. "We might actually pull this off." But outside the tent, whispers spread through the camp. The Americans knew what their captain was doing, using rare penicillin on a German prisoner while their own men waited for supplies. Some called it compassion. Others called it madness. On the third night, Collins found Hale hunched over a crate, writing by lantern light. "Sir, headquarters will find out," she warned. "Then they'll find out," Hale said simply. "Let them. If this works, it'll prove something bigger than orders." Collins studied him for a long moment. "You think it's about medicine?" Hale looked toward the tent where Erich slept. "No. It's about who we are when no one's watching." Inside, Erich dreamed of home. He saw his sister walking along the Rhine, her laughter carried by the wind. The pain in his leg had dulled to a heavy ache, no longer a scream. When he woke, he realized he could move his toes. The blackness creeping up his thigh had stopped. The skin around the wound looked raw but alive, pink and warm instead of purple and dead. He touched it with disbelief. Colin smiled faintly when she saw his expression. Penicillin, she said in halting German. It works. Erich didn't understand the word, but he understood her smile. In that moment, the young German who had expected a saw, a bullet, or a merciless death realized he had been given something he no longer thought possible: time. Outside, the desert wind howled against the tents, carrying the sound of engines and war farther away. Captain Hale stood at the entrance, the empty vial turning slowly between his fingers, the last of their supply glinting in the lantern light. He had saved one life, but at what cost to his own command? Because what they didn't yet know was that Hale's quiet defiance, his decision to use the new medicine on an enemy, had already begun its own chain reaction. It would reach the upper ranks within days, and when it did, the question would no longer be about one German soldier's leg. It would be about the conscience of an entire army. Would compassion survive the machinery of war? Captain Robert Hale's field report, meant to record a medical observation, had become an accusation wrapped in paperwork. By the time it reached division headquarters, his words, "Administered experimental antibiotic to enemy combatant with favorable result," were underlined twice in red pencil. To some, it was evidence of innovation. To others, insubordination. In a war where supplies were rationed and penicillin was still considered liquid gold, Hale's decision to use it on a prisoner of war felt to many like a betrayal. Orders were orders, and in the middle of the North African campaign, mercy didn't always make the list. Back at the field hospital, Erich Weber was recovering faster than anyone expected. The swelling in his leg had gone down, the fever was gone, and his voice, once hoarse and terrified, was steady again. He had even begun to eat, something he hadn't done in a week. But every step of his recovery seemed to bring new tension into the tent. Hale was quieter now, his visits shorter, his eyes distant, like a man waiting for a verdict. Lieutenant Sarah Collins could see it. She'd been summoned to headquarters 2 days earlier to explain the procedure. The colonel behind the desk hadn't looked at her once. "Do you understand what this means, Lieutenant?" he'd asked. "That penicillin was meant for our wounded. You and Captain Hale used it on the enemy." She had replied evenly, "We used it on a patient, sir. A human being." The colonel's pen paused mid-signature. "The War Department doesn't see it that way." When she returned to camp, she didn't tell Hale about the interrogation. He already knew. That evening, as the desert cooled and the shadows lengthened, Hale stood outside the hospital tent, staring toward the horizon where the sun was bleeding into the sand. "They think it's treason," he said softly, not turning when Collins approached. "Saving a life has turned into a political act." She wanted to tell him he'd done the right thing, but the words felt small against the weight of the war. Inside, Erich watched them through the half-open flap. He could not understand their language, but he read their faces, the lines of worry, the tension in their shoulders. He sensed that something about his survival had made these people uneasy, that his living might have cost them something. Later that night, when Eddie Morris brought him food, Erich tried to ask what was happening. "Trouble," Eddie muttered, lowering his voice. "Some officers think the doc broke the rules." He shrugged and offered a tired smile. "But he's stubborn. You'll walk again because of him." Erich nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to thank the man who had risked his own, standing to save him, but he didn't know how to form the words. Instead, he reached for the journal on the small crate beside his bed. It was a worn notebook he'd carried since basic training. The pages were filled with sketches of home, notes in cramped handwriting, half-finished letters to his sister in Stuttgart. That night, he wrote in careful German, "They treat me better than my own army would. I don't understand it. I don't know if I deserve it." The next morning, headquarters sent an inspector. He was older, formal, wearing spotless boots that looked absurd in the dust. He arrived with papers and an air of authority. Hale met him outside, saluted, and waited. The man didn't return the salute. "Captain," he said, "is it true you administered the experimental antibiotic to a German prisoner?" "Yes, sir," Hale replied. "Without authorization?" "Correct." "And you understand that drug was reserved for American personnel only?" Hale's answer came without hesitation. "I understand that I swore to heal the sick and preserve life where I could. I did exactly that." The inspector regarded him for a long moment, then tucked the report under his arm. "We'll see what Washington has to say about your interpretation of duty." When he was gone, Collins found Hale sitting on a supply crate, silent, his hands clasped together. "Was it worth it?" she asked quietly. He looked up, eyes tired but resolute. "Every time I see him move that leg, it's worth it." Days turned into weeks. The war moved on, but the little field hospital remained a fragile island of humanity amid the chaos. Erich's strength returned. He could stand now, leaning on a makeshift crutch, the muscles in his leg trembling but alive. Sometimes he caught Hale watching him from across the ward, studying his gait like an experiment in progress. Other times, the doctor seemed far away, his thoughts buried beneath reports and reprimands. One afternoon, Eddie brought in a tattered copy of Life magazine. On the cover was a photograph of New York City, skyscrapers glowing against the night sky. "Home," Eddie said with a grin, handing it to Erich. "That's what we're fighting for." Erich traced the picture with his fingers, marveling at the lights, the bridges, the vastness of a world he had been told was cruel. Nothing in the propaganda had looked like that. He looked up at the medic. "You, good man," he said in broken English. Eddie laughed. "Don't tell my sergeant that." Outside, Hale received another message, this one from command. "Further use of antibiotic on enemy personnel is prohibited until review completed." He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He knew what it meant. The next time a prisoner came in with a wound like Weber's, there would be no miracle drug. Just the saw. Just the pain. He turned toward the tent, watching the young German reading the magazine by the light of a lantern, and wondered how something as simple as compassion could be so difficult to defend. The order had been clear, but his conscience was clearer. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered like a reminder that mercy always came with a cost. And as Hale sat beneath the darkening sky, a single question refused to leave him. How many more would he have to let die before kindness itself became forbidden? Would the next test of loyalty be to his country or to his own humanity? The following week, the answer came not through orders, but through another stretcher. The trucks arrived at dusk, headlights dimmed, their beds stacked with the wounded from the front. Dust rose like smoke as medics unloaded the bodies, some breathing, some not. Among them was a boy, barely 18, his uniform torn open across the abdomen. The tag on his collar read, "Private Tommy Reed." Hale recognized the look of shock in the medics' eyes as they carried him in. Reed was one of theirs, a farm kid from Nebraska, too young to be this far from home. The surgeons moved fast, clearing space in the overcrowded tent. Hale gave instructions with clipped precision, the kind born of exhaustion and necessity. "Morphine first. Get a pulse. Prep for surgery." The same cot where Erich Weber had nearly died now held a boy from the other side of the war. Hours passed before the bleeding slowed and the room fell quiet again. Reed was alive, but barely. As dawn broke over the dunes, Hale stepped outside, his hands trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. Inside, Weber watched the doctor through the thin fabric, the way he wiped his glasses and stared toward the horizon. The man who had saved his leg now looked older, heavier, as if each life he tried to save took something from him in return. When Collins entered with new bandages, Weber tried to ask about the wounded soldier. "American?" he said softly. She nodded. "Yes, he's young." Her tone carried the same mix of pride and sadness that came with every new patient. "He will live?" Weber pressed. Collins hesitated. "If he fights as hard as you did." Later that day, Reed woke, delirious and confused, his first words a rasped question. "Where am I?" Eddie Morris leaned over him. "Field hospital. You're lucky, kid." Reed blinked, his gaze shifting toward the opposite cot where Weber sat propped up, reading the same worn magazine Eddie had given him. "What's he doing here?" he whispered. "That's a Jerry." Eddie sighed. "That's Weber. The doc saved his leg with that new medicine everyone's talking about." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me he wasted penicillin on him?" The medic didn't answer, just handed Reed a canteen. "Drink. You're gonna need your strength." Over the next few days, Reed recovered quickly, his anger fading into curiosity. The German prisoner didn't act like the monster he'd been taught to hate. He spoke quietly, kept to himself, sometimes helped the nurses fold bandages with his one good hand. One afternoon, when the generator failed and the fans stopped spinning, the air inside the tent grew thick with heat. Weber noticed Reed struggling to reach his water and limped across the space, offering his own cup. "Water," he said simply. Reed stared at him, uncertain, then took it. "Thanks," he muttered, more to the floor than to the man in front of him. That small exchange cracked something open. A day later, when boredom overtook pain, Reed asked, "So what's football like in Germany?" Weber frowned, misunderstanding. "Football? We use feet, not hands." Reed laughed, wincing from the movement. "You mean soccer?" "Soccer?" Weber repeated, puzzled. The confusion made both men laugh, a sound that drew surprised glances from nearby nurses. It was the first laughter the tent had heard in days. Outside, Hale paused by the flap and listened. In the middle of a war that had stripped men of everything, here were two soldiers, once enemies, finding common ground in a language of humor neither of them spoke well. That night, Hale wrote in his journal, "Perhaps mercy spreads the way infection does, quietly, invisibly, from one man to another." As the days stretched on, the wounds of both soldiers began to heal. Reed regained enough strength to walk a few steps with support. Weber could stand without the crutch for the first time. The field hospital had become a fragile truce, a place where lines on a map no longer mattered, but even peace had limits. One evening, orders arrived. The prisoners were to be transferred north to a formal camp. Hale read the directive in silence. "When?" Collins asked. "Tomorrow," he said. "Dawn." Word reached Weber quickly. He packed the few things he owned: a notebook, a dog tag, the half-melted piece of chocolate he'd kept like a talisman. When Hale came to check his bandages one last time, Weber spoke in halting English. "You saved me. Why?" Hale paused, setting down his instruments. "Because one day this war will end," he said. "And what we do now will decide what kind of people we'll be when it does." Weber nodded slowly, not fully understanding the words, but feeling their weight. Outside, Eddie loaded supplies into a jeep, and Reed stood leaning on a cane, watching. When the Germans were led out under guard, Reed caught Hale's eye. "That guy Weber," he said. "He's not like what they told us." Hale smiled faintly. "Most men aren't." The convoy disappeared into the horizon, a trail of dust fading into the orange dawn. Inside the tent, the sound of engines grew distant, replaced by the soft rustle of wind across the sand. Hale looked down at his journal, the page still open from the night before. Mercy spreads, he had written. But would it last? Would the fragile peace born in a hospital survive beyond its canvas walls, or would it vanish beneath the next order stamped in red ink? The war had moved north by the time Captain Hale received his next assignment. The tents were replaced by prefabricated huts, the dust by the heavy scent of diesel and disinfectant. Yet the same question followed him everywhere. How much mercy could one afford in a world built on orders? Officially, what he had done in Tunisia was no longer up for discussion. Headquarters had chosen silence, which in the army meant forgiveness disguised as indifference. The report on the unauthorized use of experimental medicine was filed away somewhere, forgotten among 1,000 other papers that told smaller, less dangerous truths. But what Hale didn't know was that his act of defiance had already become part of something larger. In Washington, new directives were being drafted, and the tone was shifting. By 1944, the War Department had issued explicit instructions. Enemy prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, not merely because it was required by treaty, but because it reflected the kind of nation America wanted to be. On paper, it sounded bureaucratic. In practice, it was revolutionary. The orders reached field hospitals first. Supplies were to be distributed by casualty count, not nationality. Medical staff were reminded that their duty was to the wounded, not the flag sewn on their sleeves. It was the first time compassion had been codified into strategy. Hale saw the difference immediately. The new prisoners, some German, some Italian, arrived not in fear, but in disbelief. They expected brutality. Instead, they found clean bandages, food, and the same medicine that had saved Erich Weber's leg. The policy worked better than anyone predicted. Reports from the front showed that German troops were surrendering more willingly to Americans than to any other force. Word had spread through the ranks. Surrender to the Americans, and you might live. Even those who had never heard of penicillin began to believe in what it represented. In the prisoner camps scattered across the United States, 380,000 German soldiers were put to work on farms, in factories, on railroads. They were given male privileges, wages, and the right to medical treatment equal to their captors. Hale's name was never mentioned in those directives, but his choice in the desert echoed through every one of them. Compassion had become policy, and policy had become power. Meanwhile, far from the paperwork and politics, Erich Weber was living proof of that change. The convoy that had taken him from Tunisia eventually delivered him to a camp in Texas, a world away from the battlefields he had left behind. There were guard towers, yes, but also baseball games, music, even a small library where he learned his first English words. The prisoners built furniture and grew vegetables in the dry soil. In the evenings, they listened to American radio through loudspeakers, jazz mixing with static. It was strange, he thought, how the enemy could sound so human. One afternoon, a camp official handed out letters. Erich received one bearing the unfamiliar mark of the Red Cross. It was from Captain Hale. "I trust your leg is healing well. The experiment worked. You were the first of many. Take care of yourself, Weber. Perhaps one day our countries will meet under better circumstances." Erich read the words again and again. His hand trembled as he wrote his reply in careful English, each sentence shaped like a confession. "Because of you, I still walk. I still live. I hope someday to thank you in person." It was the first time he had written to an American not as an enemy, but as a man. In Washington, the penicillin miracle was being industrialized. Factories turned out vials by the millions, and the drug that had once been a secret in a desert tent now became the cornerstone of modern medicine. The lessons learned from its use on soldiers, on both sides, would shape civilian hospitals for decades. But behind every official success story were the invisible ones. Men like Hale, who had chosen compassion before it was safe to do so, and men like Weber, who had survived because of it. In 1945, when the war finally ended, those choices became the quiet foundation of something new. The policy that had begun as a moral experiment became a tool of diplomacy. As Germany lay in ruins, America needed allies, not ghosts. The humane treatment of prisoners became a bridge across what might have been an unending divide. Hale returned home to Ohio that winter. He found work at a small hospital, traded khaki for white, and carried on as though the war had been another lifetime. But sometimes, when he cleaned his instruments or signed a chart, he thought of that desert tent, the smell of rot and dust, and the moment a dying enemy became a patient. He kept a single vial of penicillin on his desk as a reminder that every moral revolution begins with a choice. And somewhere in Texas, under the same flag that had once terrified him, Erich Weber practiced English by the dim light of a barracks lamp, repeating words from his American dictionary: hope, kindness, peace. By the time he was repatriated to Germany in early 1946, he no longer saw the world in uniforms and ranks. He saw it in faces: Hale's, Collins's, Eddie's, the people who had shown him that humanity could exist even in war. Yet as he boarded the ship bound for Bremerhaven, he wondered whether that kindness would survive peace as well as it had survived battle. Would the world remember the lessons of compassion? Or would victory make men forget? The ship's horn sounded across the gray Atlantic, and Corporal Erich Weber stood at the rail watching the shoreline fade. The sea wind smelled of salt and coal, colder than anything he remembered from the desert. For the first time in years, he was no longer a prisoner, but he did not yet feel free. Around him, men who had once worn the same uniform spoke in low voices about the ruins waiting for them. The cities bombed flat, the families scattered, the homes turned to ash. Erich listened without joining. His thoughts were far away, back in the heat of Tunisia, in a tent that smelled of medicine and dust. He reached into his coat pocket, where a folded letter rested, creased from rereading. It was from Captain Robert Hale, written in the careful hand of a man who still believed words could heal. "Walk if you can, Weber," it said. "There's a world waiting for people who still remember how." By the time the ship reached Germany, the docks were lined with the wreckage of a nation learning to breathe again. Bremerhaven was a skeleton city, shattered cranes, silent factories, hollow windows staring at the sky. The Red Cross processed the returning prisoners one by one, handing out ration books and instructions. When Erich's name was called, he was limping but alive, the proof of one man's defiance. He traveled south by rail through landscapes that looked as though the earth itself had surrendered. Burned-out towns gave way to empty fields, and every village smelled faintly of smoke. In Stuttgart, where his family home had once stood, he found only a foundation and a half-collapsed chimney. But his sister Anna had survived. She was working in a refugee kitchen run by the Americans. When she saw him, she covered her mouth with her hands and began to cry. "They said you were dead," she whispered. "The Americans saved me," he told her simply, as though that explained everything. Over the next months, Erich rebuilt what he could: a small room above the kitchen, a life made from ration cards and borrowed hope. He found work translating for the Allied administration, his English still clumsy but improving. It was strange, he thought, to be the bridge between conqueror and conquered. Yet every time he heard the word penicillin, he felt the ache in his leg and remembered the man who had given it to him. 2 years later, in 1948, he sat at a wooden desk with a borrowed typewriter and began a letter. It took him 3 weeks to finish. "Dear Dr. Hale," it began, "you may not remember me. My name is Erich Weber. You treated me for infection in North Africa. Because of you, I walk. Because of you, I live to see my country rise again. I wanted you to know that Germany is learning from what we saw in your country. The mercy, the fairness, the dignity. You showed me that enemies can choose to be human. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that gift. When the letter reached Ohio months later, Hale was working in a small hospital outside Cincinnati. He opened the envelope during his lunch break and read it twice before folding it back with trembling hands. That night, he wrote his reply. Erich, I do remember you. You were my first patient who made me question what medicine really means. I am proud of what you have become. Keep walking. The world needs men who remember what mercy looks like. Their correspondence continued for 20 years, short letters at first, then longer ones as the decades settled into peace. They wrote about everything and nothing, about the rebuilding of Germany, about Hale's growing children, about Anna's marriage, about the strange way time could turn enemies into friends. In 1968, after saving for months, Erich finally boarded another ship, this time heading west. The Atlantic looked different when you traveled it by choice. When he arrived in New York, the skyline rose like the cover of that old magazine Eddie had once given him. From there, he took a train to Ohio. Hale was waiting for him at the station, older now, his hair gone gray, his posture still unmistakably military. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Hale smiled, extended his hand, and said, "How's the leg?" Erich laughed, tapping his cane against the platform. "Still walking." They spent 3 days together, talking about everything the war had tried to erase. Hale introduced him to his wife and children, took him to a baseball game, and finally, keeping an old promise, drove him to Philadelphia for a cheesesteak. Sitting in a crowded diner, the two men raised their glasses of beer in a quiet toast, to survival, to peace, to the absurdity of it all. "You know," Hale said, "I didn't save you because you were German. I saved you because you were dying." Erich nodded. "And that made me want to live." They parted with the same handshake they had shared 24 years earlier in the desert. Back in Stuttgart, Erich became a teacher, instructing students in English and modern history. He told them about democracy, about the Geneva Convention, about how nations could choose decency even when surrounded by destruction. When he spoke of America, his voice carried neither bitterness nor blind praise, only gratitude. "They showed me that humanity is a language everyone can learn," he would tell his class. Years later, when Hale passed away in 1996, Erich received the news by letter. He flew once more to America, this time to attend the funeral. Standing by the graveside beneath an overcast sky, he laid a single white rose and whispered, "You saved more than my leg, my friend. You saved what was left of my soul." When Erich himself died in 2002, his daughter found a trunk filled with yellowed envelopes, letters from Hale, from Collins, from Eddie Morris, each one a small testament to the quiet revolution that had begun in a tent half a century earlier. At his funeral, she read one of the last lines from his diary. "I am grateful for every step I take on this leg. It reminds me that compassion, once given, never truly dies. It crosses oceans." As the camera of history pulls back from that moment, from the graves, the letters, the fading ink, the voice of the story lingers. A German soldier had faced amputation, but what he found instead was something far rarer than survival. He found humanity. And maybe, in a world still at war with itself, that's the medicine we've never stopped needing.